Hello and welcome to Quality Policing. I am Peter Moskos. This episode was recorded on October 10th, 2018 in my office at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in Manhattan. I mention that because what starts as a one-on-one conversation with me and Eugene O'Donnell ends up with a group of 4 professors at John Jay College. Gene and I were joined first by Martin Horn, who was appointed by New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg to serve as Commissioner of New York City Department of Probation, and then a year later, Marty began to serve simultaneously as the Commissioner of the New York City Department of Corrections, which includes the entire city's jail system, including America's largest jail, or collection of jails, Rikers Island. Along with other accomplishments, he reduced suicides and cut jail violence in half. Then Louis Anemone just happens to pop his head in my office, so he joined us as well. Anemone was the chief of department in the New York City Police Department when he retired in 1999 after 34 years on the job. He was the department's 3rd highest official and oversaw strategies such as CompStat that won praise for driving down violent crime. He was the highest-ranking uniform member in the police department, which means he was basically responsible for running the daily nitty-gritty of the department, of America's largest police department. For those who know Anemone only through perhaps having to face him in CompStat or from his reputation, which admittedly was rather fearsome, you might just listen to this episode because you get to hear Lou Anemone laugh. The topics change as different people enter my office, but I start with Eugene O'Donnell and we talk about anti-police bias in the media and the general ideological problems of police reform. But the episode goes on to talk about broken windows and how to reduce violence in jails. So it varies a bit. It kind of reminded me of that old TV show, Wailing Jennings and Friends. You probably never saw it. A bunch of people sit around, shoot the shit, but I promise you that we will not start singing country tunes during this episode. Eugene O'Donnell was a police officer and prosecutor in New York City.
Sure. Eugene O'Donnell, professor at John Jay College, former police officer, former prosecutor in Brooklyn and Queens, police trainer in other countries. There are very few places these days for anybody writing moderately about policing and not in a nonpartisan kind of way to even place a piece. Got such advocacy journalism. But the piece was about
But I can place pieces in CNN.com and Washington Post. And
I think they better be in conformance with their party line, more or less.
I don't think I'm in conformance.
I would, I can tell you that I've personally had major issues with both the New York Times and the Washington Post. I believe there's a full frontal attack that needs to take place on the Washington Post and the New York Times, which I think have been absurdly anti-police, absurdly blind to the entire picture, ridiculously acontextual, and they've done it over and over and over again. It is almost farcical. It is almost a lampoon when you see the coverage both of those institutions have repeatedly. The New York Times in particular has never missed an opportunity to have a negative story about the police, even if they got to go to Wichita to get it, even if they got to go to Portland to get it. The amount of negative coverage they have done about the NYPD. This isn't we have the Health and Hospitals Corporation in New York City, which runs a multi-billion-dollar hospital system, and there's zero reporting. Imagine the acts of malpractice, probably murder in HHC. I've never yet seen any kind of investigative reporting just on that one giant, mega, totally opaque institution, or I've seen scores of articles on the NYPD. Anything that they can pick up that is negative, their reporting on stop and frisk was shameful. They did against scores of. This is a metro section that has room for 5 stories that invariably is obsessed with the police.
Al Baker is a good journalist at the New York Times. He writes fairly about the NYPD.
To the best of his ability. I'd be happy to take the New York Times and have somebody show me where the editorial board has written something thoughtful about the police, contextualized.
He's not on the edit. Al Baker is not on the editorial
board. Yeah, and Al
board.
does some reporting, but even Al was dragged into the maelstrom of the stop and frisk reporting, which was just, it was incredible. I mean, literally, did they do 100 stories? They must have done 100 stories. In this limited space that they have, they must have done 100 stories on stop and frisk, never contextualizing the issue in terms of the whole argument about equality, that the police interaction should be equal. This is the newspaper of record saying that in a city that's so completely unequal, where crime is so unequally distributed. And also there's an elitist undertone, which is the police are just working class idiots, and they'll do what they're told to do, and they'll salute and do it and just carry on. This elite has no respect for their working class rights and due process rights. Most policing is self-initiated. It's what cops choose to do. They don't have to do much of anything. That the biggest problem in the country is that most police departments are useless. That it's rare to see police departments that actually care about crime and disorder. New York actually was one of the few, and that now police departments all over the country, the cops were of their own volition standing down. And that I think, as I've said to you and I've said in various places, we're at a point now where policing is terminally damaged and will not be resuscitated. The left has become in love with quoting the crimes drops that they never credited when it was done by different people with different politics. So now they point to it as what is the real story on public safety in New York City? What is really going on? Love to go out and talk to the community, love to get their opinion. I guarantee you that their opinion is totally inconsistent with the elite that has hijacked this conversation. I guarantee you there's a big fear factor. I guarantee you people are navigating their neighborhoods very carefully, even in this super safe city. And I guarantee you there's a giant disparity between the people who live in doorman buildings and those who live in public housing. And they've been totally silenced. I don't hear anything from those people. I used to be a liaison in the Queensbridge houses. I used to hear from people, and I knew, and I'd be surprised if this changed, the total disconnect from what people feel on the ground from this elite that has captured the conversation.
When stop and frisk went down 80-90% in New York City, you presumably thought crime was going to go up.
I didn't.
You didn't?
No.
Why not?
Because I think that's bogus. The idea that it's a science is ridiculous. There's no science to it.
What's the difference between Chicago and New York? How has New York stayed mostly safe by comparison, and Chicago has not?
New York's incomparable. New York is a world city. It's in a totally different place. There's no comparing New York to any other city in America.
Well, what happened in Chicago then?
City of Chicago, 2/3 of that city is dead and dying, essentially, whereas every single New York City neighborhood is vigorous and on the way up. Every single one to the last geographic, I can't think of any community in New York City that is not, where there hasn't been huge inward investment, where real estate's not booming.
There are almost no vacant lots in New York City.
Virtually none.
Maybe a few out in the Rockaways, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, everything is more or less spoken for, and and you look at Chicago, the west side, the south side are it literally looks like a bomb has dropped in both parts of the city. And
the out-migration now of African Americans from Chicago is equal to the in-migration during the Great Migration. There is a massive flight of population from high-crime neighborhoods in Chicago, and nobody seems to care.
Well, you're not even allowed to say that now, because the hard left has constructed this argument that they should be called out, and every single time they've engineered this disingenuous argument of the equality argument, that policing in Austin and Chicago is going to be the same as Beverly Hills. It's ludicrous. It shouldn't be allowed. It piggybacks a lot of fallacies and falsehoods that have made policing
Explain some of that, because I think I know what you're saying, but be explicit. Well,
there is no policing on the north side. I mean, most of the police resources in Chicago, I hope, would be not in the north side. If you take a homicide map, a shooting map of major cities in America, there are no white victims. Add up the white victims in Baltimore, add up the white victims in New York, Chicago, Detroit, keep going, Washington. In terms of proportionality, look at the number of black homicide victims in the top 8 black cities. It is disgustingly that nobody talks about it, and that the left has made it their mission, as they've made it their mission, that you can't say this now. You can't say it, that somehow you're doing something unfair when you point this out, and they want to pivot always to root cause navel gazing. That's where they want to be. They want at the end, they want to just be able to say, well, we got to solve root cause problems, and it's okay which means it's okay for 20,000 I think 25,000 people have been murdered in Chicago since 94. 25,000 people. And the left, the New York Times, the Washington Post, has nothing to say about that. Not a thing, not ever, not once. And they have fueled this acontextual attack.
I think you made a good point. Everything is geared towards root causes, inequality, and the catchphrase for the past few years more and more is white supremacy. Problems that have existed in America literally for centuries, that we have to fix these problems before we can keep people safe in certain neighborhoods. That's the part I find sort of offensive, especially because there's no real proof that A, we can fix these problems, period, but B, that they actually are the root causes of crime. When crime went down in New York, the number of young men living in poverty increased in the 1990s in New York City. The recent changes in homicides in Chicago, in Baltimore, and now in Philadelphia, it's not correlating with an outflux of jobs. These are separate variables. And the one thing that does seem to change is policing, but to say that policing matters in a positive way, that's what I think the taboo is.
Paralysis is perfect for them because they're not the victims. And they're most assuredly not the victims. And because if their children were being murdered and anywhere near that kind of level, we'd have a national emergency. The progressive left is famous for putting their safety first and foremost. I mean, and I don't want to take, and I consider myself the progressive left. I'm talking about the crazy hard left that has dominated this. And sadly, I am talking about particularly the editorial boards of the Washington Post and New York Times, which are shameful. They're repeatedly shameful, and they have played a role also. Remember, the bigger issue here is they've delegitimized the system. They've spent all their time saying nobody's arrested who deserves to be arrested. Everybody who's arrested has been falsely accused. The exoneration lobby has captured this conversation. It's a creaky, broken, ugly system. It's the only one we have. And it is not operating in places to the great harm of people that happen to be stuck in those places who can't leave those places. Just talk to people in the neighborhood. It will not resemble anything that the elites are pumping out.
When reporters go, of course, you're talking to people who generally are hanging out either at 2 p.m. or 2 a.m. on a weeknight. A lot of the people that you've alluded to, first of all, they might be afraid to answer the door, but they're at work. They're not easy to reach. If you talk to the people actually causing the problems, they're less likely to tell you that the solution is more and better policing.
There's $1 billion in negative publicity were given to the police in 5 years, so I don't think any institution could survive that answer. We should also talk about the right, because the right started this. The right started this with their insanity. Now the left is replacing one kind of insanity with another kind of insanity.
What was the right's insanity?
Broken windows was insane.
Wait a second.
Yes. I go back. I wrote a chapter.
I don't defend zero tolerance. I defend broken windows.
I wrote a chapter attacking that 2000. I thought that was a ludicrous proposition.
Let's talk about this for a minute, because it surprises me you say that, because I think broken windows has become hijacked by the anti-policing left and has become a toxic term.
Well, they gave them a gift because it was always a little ridiculous.
But based on the ideas of Jane Jacobs and what makes an urban street functional, eyes on the street, mixed use, broken windows, as explained by George Kelling, says the public shouldn't be afraid. And if people aren't afraid, they're going to use the streets more. And if good people use the streets more, they're going to be safer. And you get this sort of virtuous, positive feedback loop. So police shouldn't just focus on 911 responses to crimes that already happened. They should focus on what the public wants them to care about. And that usually are minor quality of life issues and things that cause fear. So they did that. It started with Bratton in the subways, right, and turnstile jumping. Why is that such a crazy or objectionable or bad thing for police to do? What else are police doing?
It was imposed on people. There was no consensual. This was the police just telling. There was no attempt to enlist elected officials or community people. This was just imposed elitism in the hands of the worst possible politician in the United States of America, one Rudy Giuliani, who did everything he could to provoke, attack, disparage, run down the black community. That was his entire shtick. It was a dark day for race relations in the city, and he used it in the most divisive way you could use it. And the cops, if you talk to the cops, the old-time cops, would never have endorsed that kind of... The old-time cops used to say things like, we have to live here. There was a balancing act. Who was George Kelling to come in with this idea, sell it? I guess Braden bought it because Braden needed something. There was a PR element to it. I have all kinds of criticisms of broken windows.
So even though that's what Bratton said he was doing, and even though murders went down, even though they said it couldn't happen, it wasn't happening. So you think it just happened?
No,
It's not Bratton's to his credit?
No, I think the credit that Bratton deserves is that, first of all, he was respected by the police. He may be the last